Well, once again, I apologize for starting on time. People are going to come in late, and they're going to say, hey, it's not fair. You're going to tell us. It happens in synagogues once in a while. Anyhow, okay, so welcome. Tonight is the second of this lecture series for the 3 weeks, and we'll make it formal for 2025, the summer, the 3 weeks of 2025. And the title is The Jews and Assimilation. And tonight's lecture, as you can see, is called The Challenge of Persia and then Islam. So as I tried to start with the last series, people assimilate. The question is, how do you respond to that? Okay? It's not possible not to assimilate to your surroundings. The question is, how much and how do you do it? And do you do without losing your identity, or do with losing your identity? These are the serious issues. Okay? And as you can see, tonight is being sponsored by Herman and Sherry in memory of Talia Bromwitz-Lebner, 10th yard site. There they are back there, I was wondering. This is always good to see them, and this is on Herman's home ground because his parents are among the founders of the shul. If I mentioned in the past, right?
Bar mitzvah here.
What's that?
His bar mitzvah was here.
His bar mitzvah was here. Yeah, okay, that could be. And he also tied his shoe once. That's a historical fact. Anyhow, no, I'm kidding. So thank you very much. We have 5 out of 6 sponsored now, so I need one more sponsor, and then we're done. Of course, as always, we want to thank the shul. It is nice of them. They provide the air conditioning and the hosting and all the rest of that. And we want to thank, of course, our sponsors, Herman and Sherry. I want to give a shout out to Shmuel Tarshish back there, who's been a gigantic help lately in arranging for all the sponsorships. That's it. He deserves to go. Well, you're the beneficiary. I mean, let's put it this way. You're the beneficiaries. And finally, our tech team, who are actually very efficient now, and we're actually starting someone in time as soon as I cease to ramble. Okay? So I think that's it. Let's get down to business. So tonight we're talking about responding challenges in a different context. Last time, we discussed assimilation in the context of Hellenism. This kind of applied to the Greek and the Roman empires. When you say Hellenism, you mean the civilization of that era, which is like 300 BC to 400 CE, 500 CE, whatever. The Roman Empire, in its pagan form, as far as the Jews are concerned, it's like 100 BCE to 300 CE, and then it switched to Christian, right? So that's another matter. That's for another time. When that happened, when the Roman Empire switched to Christian, the Jews faced a different challenge, okay? And a different set of assimilation challenges. But I'm talking about the good old Roman Empire from the movies, and when you had the gods, and the paganism, and the temples, and the whole 9 yards. But for many centuries, it was the pagan Roman Empire. This is of extreme importance to you and I today, because this period of the Roman Empire was the era of the consolidation of rabbinic Judaism, which is the form of Judaism you and I practice today. Okay? So there's the Roman Empire, and you can just imagine, there are a couple of dots over there, but imagine it looked like freckles, a whole bunch of little dots everywhere. And those are Jewish communities. So there were Jewish communities all over the Roman Empire. There are even some people suggest there was 1 million or 2 million Jews in them. I don't know how they know that. But there were a lot of small Jewish communities all over the place, which is just interesting, okay, because you don't usually associate that with Roman Empire. Rabbinic Judaism is a term we call for the Judaism that emerges from the Talmud. Obviously, once upon a time, the Gemara did not exist. And therefore, not all Jewish practices were identical to what we do today. Just to make it easy without getting too complicated on this and too detailed, and get off too much on a tangent, you find a lot of times in the Gemara, as I'm sure everybody here is aware, a lot of debates over different things. So let's say, for example, for argument's sake, let's say they're arguing whether a certain fish is kosher. Is that called fins and scales or something like that? And you'll find, for example, I don't know, Rabbi Akiva says it's kosher, and Rabbi Gamliel says it's not kosher, let's say, for example. What does that mean? What do people do? Well, in Rabbi Gamliel, where he lived, they treated it as kosher. And where Rabbi Kiva did, they didn't. Okay? To use an example from today, I think we all know in Morocco, some eat the have kosher grasshoppers, right? And because they say they have Masorah, which grasshoppers are kosher, and some are. You just don't know which ones they are. And before you go, it's in the fancy stores is a lot of money. So one Jewish community considered something kosher, the other one did not. What did people do? The answer is there was a variety of practice. Now, it's not an endless variety of practice. Nobody said you can't eat a ham sandwich. Nobody said you can light a match in the middle of Saturday. There were definitely parameters. But within those parameters, there's a lot of room. You understand? So what emerges is Rabbinic Judaism is the one that the rabbinical class, the rabbis produce, and their discussions, the authoritative ones, and end up in some form or another, in literary form, in the Talmud. Otherwise, we wouldn't even know they exist. The only thing that's preserved was preserved in books. And there weren't many books. And therefore, that ends up being the practice of everybody, or it's supposed to be. So when you talk about Orthodox Judaism, that's another way of saying the Judaism of the Talmud. You get it? Now, it ain't always easy to know what the Talmud means. Welcome to the world of yeshivas and all that stuff. Because it really is, not so easy. On the other hand, everybody's committed to that standard. But in the old days, like in the Roman Empire, when there was no such thing as a Talmud, there was no such thing as a Mishnah, all the rest of it, you had various forms of Judaism operating in different places. Some which we call Hellenistic Judaism. Okay? Hellenistic Judaism has nothing to do with the Hanukkah story in the Hellenists. It's the Judaism that was practiced in different communities all over this map. Okay? All over this map. So it could be, like I said before, to make it easy, in this part of the country they ate this fish, and over here they didn't, and over here you could do this on Shabbos, and over here you couldn't, and so forth and so on. You just got used to it. It's a little bit, like Sephardim versus Ashkenazim, that sort of thing. A little bit, okay? And so, I'm not talking about the Hellenism like you see in the journalism now, but I'm talking about the way Judaism was practiced all over the place. And don't you doubt that, like over here, the Judaism and the practices were obviously affected by the non-Jewish culture around them, either to the right or to the left. That's what we mean by assimilation. Now, they didn't lose their Jewish identity, you understand? And they didn't stop being Jewish. That happened once in a while, just like all the time. Some people convert from A to Z. That could be, but I'm talking about people who are not converting. And the very fact that, like I said before, you have the prayers in the synagogue being a Greek word, in Greek and not in English, so you have like today English prayers, and that sort of thing. Whereas in Israel, something like that, they'd be shocked at a thing like that. I'm talking about 2,000 years ago. So just get used to this variety business, okay? The rabbis, as we call them, appear in history after the Churban Bayis, after the destruction of the Second Temple, and the consequent desuetude of the old elites, like the priests. In other words, if you look in the Chumash and in the Tanakh, how do you practice? What do you do in Pesach? Right? You say, what do you mean on Pesach? You don't eat chametz. Okay, I get that. Now, what do you do other than that? Well, you have a Seder. No. The Seder came later in Jewish history as a Drabonim. Okay? So, really, all you have to do is you have a Korban Pesach. If you live in Israel. And if you get to the Beis HaMikdash. So what did Jews do once upon a time long ago when Pesach came around? If there was no Korban Pesach? It's a fair question I'm asking. So they had to come up with something, or maybe they didn't come up with anything. We don't know exactly. But there was a void that had to be filled. That's my point. You understand? And you have to understand that we don't hear the rabbinical voices in the literature, because there was no literature. There was a Torah Sheba'al Peh. So it's hard for us to get it exactly what happened. You can do it, but I don't want to get too boring on you. But one thing is clear. The center was the Beis HaMikdash. And in the Second Temple period, the action was in the temple. And all the Jews around the world agreed with that. And they would, from all over here, they would send presents. And if somebody was able to, like the Muslims make the Hajj, if somebody was able to, somebody would try to make it one time to the Beis HaMikdash. This is life in the old days. You know, somebody goes to visit here and then comes back over here. People say, what was it like? If you're old enough, you'll remember what it was like 50, 60 years ago when somebody would come back from Baltimore from Israel. What'd you see? What was there? Now it's a different story, but you know, what'd you see? And we have a lot of records of that. Okay, a lot of records of that. And so, yes, the Beis Hamikdash is where all this stuff happened. And who runs the Beis Hamikdash? The Kohanim. And you had a Sanhedrin, that's true. And they run the show. So what do you do in Rosh Hashanah? What do you do in Yom Kippur? Look in the Chumash, it's all karbonos. Correct? It's all karbonos. What do you do in Shavuos? It's all karbonos. There's no such thing as staying up and learning all night. So what do you do? It's a fair question. It's a little bit like the last day of Pesach when ain't nothing to do, right? In other words, you have Shavuos. You don't do work. I get it. So what do? You know, you go back to work the next day, and your Gentile colleagues say, what'd you do on the holiday? You say, oh, it was exhausting. What'd you do? I ate and slept. I'm wiped out. Okay? And they look at you like you're crazy. So this is the way life was lived. When the Beis Hamikdash was destroyed, these elites ceased, or at least the Kohanim did, meaning there's nothing to do anymore. Used to be every day is a carbon tamid, and a carbon this and that, and 1,000 rules of kachim and taharas, and and this thing and that thing. They're out of a job. Now the Kohanim survived as human beings, right? I'm a Kohen, but I'm out of a job. Okay, you daven every day to get back to have a job. Although I'm probably too old by now, but you know what I'm saying. So that kind of hereditary elite, which was very powerful once in time, didn't exist anymore. So what happened to the other elites? Well, the non-frum actually left Judaism because once the temple was destroyed and everybody got massacred and the Romans, all the rest of it, the opportunists hit the road. That's what happened in Jewish history. And so the ones left holding back are the scholars or the rabbis. This is a meritocratic class, not a hereditary one. You can't be a priest unless your father's a priest. But you can be a scholar, not necessarily if your father's a scholar, because you might not be able to be a scholar yourself. You know, brains is not necessarily hereditary, although it gives you a leg up. But somebody could be like Rabbi Akiva, somebody came from a zero background, as we would say today, and he was a poor shepherd, but by merit, by the brains, he became a big person. That's what you call today the academic world. It's supposed to be, if you can cut the mustard, if you got if you can publish and produce, you'll get somewhere. So this is how Judaism changed in a very important way. So I'm talking about this era of the Roman Empire is the age of the Tanoim and the Amoraim. That's when they lived, in the time of the Roman Empire. The Tanoim lived in the Roman Empire. So these are the people who wrote the Mishnah and the Tosefta and all that. They live over here. And all the action of the Tanaic period happens in Israel or Roman Palestine by that time. There is no Jerusalem. Jerusalem has been flattened, correct? And was rebuilt. It was built as a city no Jews are allowed in. It's the Roman times. But on the other hand, they operated. The Tanaic literature is written in Hebrew, which always raises the question, did people talk Hebrew? Or were they assimilated or not? The answer is they were assimilated. Rabbi Yehuda Nossi, who wrote the Mishnah, happened to be a nut for Ivrit. That was his thing. He was anti-Yiddish. As you see, Hani Loshen Sursi Lamali, O Ivrit, O Yvanit. He had that sensibility. I don't like this Yiddish. At that time, Sursi is Syriac. So there's a certain type of Aramaic to mix together with Jewish expressions. It's a kind of a Yiddish. And he said, I don't like that. Either Hebrew or English, as we say today. O Ivrit, O Yvanit. Either Hebrew or Greek. And he was a big person for Hebrew. Some people remember the famous stories that his employees, his maid, knew Ivrit better than the Jews. That's when the rabbis didn't know a word, they would go ask her, what does this mean? Something like that. Because, there are some people that are like that. I remember a few people like it when I was a kid. In Baltimore, Maryland. And that if therefore the period of the Mishnah and the Tosefta and Medrash Halacha, these are the books produced in this era, are influenced by or needed to react to the challenge of Roman and Greek pagan culture. And I think right now, the Daf Yomi is doing a bit of Zarah. Am I right about that? Yeah. Right? Yes. So the Masechtas Avodah Zarah is all, especially the Tanaic part of it, is all reacting to the paganism in the Roman Greek times. I know they talk about Mercury over there, and they talk about Jupiter, and they talk about different pagan practices and things like this. They're talking about the surrounding culture. By the way, you know what they say: don't leave your kid alone with a pagan, and don't leave your animal alone with a pagan, and things like that. I mean, they're talking about the life of the Roman times. Greek words are all over the place in Tanaic literature. Sometimes people don't realize it. It's an old joke. All right, let's go to the next one. Next one, yeah. There's an old joke that says whoever says that Chazal used Gaisha words is Epicurus, because Epicurus is a Greek word. So Epicurus was a Greek philosopher. Okay, my point is like this: there's a ton of words in the Mishnah and in the Medrash and all the rest of it, which are Greek. Okay, why? Because in the Eastern Roman Empire, you spoke Greek even after the Roman Empire, and that means that you didn't live in an old Jewish society. Just like today in Israel, I don't care if you live in Mea Sharm, you're still going to say internet, right? Even though there is a Hebrew word for it, but I think it's mershetet or something. But they'll look at you like you're nuts, okay? And therefore, let's put it this way: there were various Judaisms. Let's go to the next one. Various Judaisms that operated in the Roman Empire. The Rabbinic Judaism, that's the one you and I know. There was the Hellenistic one, which is the one I was talking about, that was all over the Roman Empire. And then there was the third type of Judaism, which at that time was still a form of Judaism, or claimed to be, and that was Jews for Jesus literally, what emerged as the Christian religion, as a distinct religion. But originally it was kind of a Jewish. And these guys were all over the place. So wherever you went, certainly Eastern Mediterranean, you saw some Jews who adhered to Rabbinic Judaism. You saw other Jews adhere to Hellenistic Judaism, one kind or another. That would be more like your traditional types that we say today. And then you see these other guys who are, going around with this Christian stuff and say, hey, we're Jewish too, you must count us for a minion and all the rest of it. That's how it went. However, my friends, there was another country with a big Jewish population outside the Roman Empire, okay? And outside the Western culture. And this was Babylonia, okay? So this was, what you're seeing over here is the old Iranian Empire. The Persians have had several empires, and they're trying to build one now, okay? If you understand the Israel-Iran clash, part of it has to do with the fact that Iran is still dreaming of the old days, and being religious, they're asking themselves, why did Allah take our empire away from us and subject us to the Muslims and all the other stuff, and we're going to get it back. And ever since 1979, Khomeini, and even the Shah really, was dreaming of the old glories. And, as you know, they have outposts like the Hezbollah and the Houthis and the other sorts of things. The Arabs aren't stupid. They know this, and therefore the Arabs who are over here are always fighting Iran or trying to prevent that from happening. You understand? So you have two different, visions of empire that are clashing right now. Thank God for that. Now, the customs and practices of the Jews in Babylonia, because here's Babel, what I'm pointing to right here. This is Iran today. It was all part of the Iranian Empire. And over here, that I'm pointing to right now, that's what we call today Iraq. The word Iraq didn't exist at that time. Instead it was called Babel. The Greeks, of course, called it Mesopotamia. Mesopotamia means the land between the two rivers. And there's the Tigris and the Euphrates River, and that's the territory over there. So that had a very big Jewish population, okay? And the customs and practices of the Jews in Babylonia are pretty much what we do today. Isn't that funny? Well, it's called the Babylonian Talmud. You see what I'm saying? We kind of forget, so we take for granted. And Judaism, think about it, Judaism is not a Western religion. It's not a Western religion. Now, Jews have, as part of the assimilation, from time to time, westernized Jewish practice and Jewish ways of operating, and sometimes they go farther than they do at other times. And one of the arguments about Reform Judaism is how much westernized should you go? You understand? How westernized should you go? But originally, as you know, Judaism, as we understand it today, is an Eastern religion. Remember, the Jews have been in Babylonia by this time for 600 years. We say Nebuchadnezzar destroyed the temple. Yeah, they give the date 585 BCE. Maybe it's a little right, maybe it's a little wrong, but that's almost 600 years BCE. And the time of the Gemara and all the rest of it, you're talking about 100 CE, 200 CE, 300 CE. That means by the time of the Tanaim Amoraim, the Jews have been in Bubba a long, long time. Longer than the Jews have been in the United States. Okay? I mean, we think somebody's grandparents that came in Baltimore like, whoa, like the Pilgrims. It's 600 years we're talking about over here. They had increased and multiplied over centuries. And they dressed like the local non-Jews. They spoke Aramaic, not Hebrew. Everybody knows what's the language of the Babylonian Talmud. It's a Yiddish form of Aramaic, so to speak. Right? It's not identical exactly with the classical Aramaic. It's classical Aramaic with a Jewish to it. Okay? They integrate into the local economy. As a matter of fact, this will surprise you. In the time of the Gemara, the Jews were the majority population in Iraq. Isn't that interesting? The Jews were the majority, certainly in southern Iraq. Okay? The Jews were the majority population over there. There was a lot of them. Okay? But they were different in religion. There we go again. In other words, the way they responded to the assimilation business was by emphasizing their religious otherness. You see what I'm saying? Now, every once in a while, they're sliding into Gentile practices. And you always find in the Gemara all the rest of it says, don't do that, it's Chukas HaGoyim, and then, and the rabbis are, blasting the people, all the rest of it. But I'm sure just like today, so a rabbi could say, what are you listening to a baseball game? That's all Goyish. And the person's like, Same thing happened, 2,000 years ago. They were different in religion. And we know from the Talmud itself that there were many areas in Bavel, we're told, where there was Ein Torah. There was no Torah. Meaning, they weren't scholars, and they practiced Judaism as they understood it. And you could be doggone sure there was a heavy dose of Babylonian Goyishkeit in their Judaism, and that's what they were used to. Indeed, we're told that Rav and Shmuel, so I think it was Shmuel, when it was Rav, moved his yeshiva, was it to Surah or Nerdea? I think to Surah, because like a Lithuanian yeshiva, Rosh Yeshiva 100 years ago, he said, I want to put a yeshiva in an area where there's no Yiddishkeit to up the game. You understand? To teach the people about Judaism. And so they found the yeshivas in the sticks, as it were, precisely to spread the rabbinic Judaism. So again, if you know the Gemara Kedushin, there's a lot of places with heavy intermarriage, and there's a lot of places where there was this and the other. There was a certain assimilation there without question. The rabbis are opposed to that. How successful are they? Depends when, it depends where. Sometimes more, sometimes less. So the Jews were assimilated here, not to the Hellenistic culture, but to the Persian culture, because the Babylonia was under the Iranian Empire. Iran is the country next door. Babel is not Iranian, but they tried to Persianize it. And Persia is a great ancient culture. Okay? I don't like Persia today to try and wipe out Israel, but the Persian culture is one of the great world cultures. They got their own art and literature, ancient stuff, and poetry. They got cuisine of their own. They got everything, you see? And so it's a rich culture, like the Greek. And the Jews, therefore, are not in an area where they're just surrounded by a bunch of hillbillies who can't read and write. They're under an area in which there's literacy, and there's culture, and there's a lot of religious stuff of their own, all the rest of it. The Gemara and all that doesn't take place in a vacuum. It was in Persian-ruled Babylonia that the rabbis would produce the Babylonian Talmud, which happened to emerge as the supreme canonical text in Judaism. It's kind of funny, okay? That's quite a statement I just made. Many people think the Talmud originated in Lithuania. But actually, it's in Babylonia, okay? Now, the Babylonian Talmud reflects its environment the same way the Art Scroll reflects the American environment. If you can read an Art Scroll text, and yes, the content is Jewish and Torahic and all the rest of it, it's in English, it's been edited, they got modern American graphics, you see? They got, subject headings, they got something called an index, and a table of contents, and chances are they have an artistic cover, which was produced by modern American technology. You see, desktop publishing and all the rest of it. So it's very American. It's very American. And by the way, the Art Scroll publishes in Ivrit for Israelis. Why doesn't Israel come up with a thing like that? So I'm just saying, it's American. Well, the Talmud Bavli, the Babylonian Talmud, is like that. Babylonian Talmud reflects Babylonian technology of that time. The content is Jewish, right? But also reflects the language of that time and obviously the principles of organization. There is no table of contents in the Talmud. There is no index in the Talmud. That's how they did business in those days. There's no punctuation in the Talmud. You know what I'm saying? That's what makes it hard. And all the rest of it. Those were the norms in the culture in which they lived. You understand? That's how they did it. There are a lot of Persian words in the Talmud Bavli, not Greek words. There's the Talmud Yerushalmi and the Talmud Bavli. The Talmud Yerushalmi is a misnomer because the Jews were not living in Jerusalem at that time. They were forbidden to live in Jerusalem for 500 years. But it means the Talmud that was produced in Eretz Yisrael. Well, that was the Roman Empire. So what kind of words do you find all the time in the Talmud Yerushalmi? Greek. Okay? I told you the other day, in the Talmud Bavli, which is Persian, they don't know what the Afikomen is. So they have 5 different guesses. In the Talmud Yerushalmi, they say it's kind of dancers. Okay? So, because they knew what it is. I don't know if they knew exactly, but probably they did. And across the board. So, if that's characteristic of the Talmud Yerushalmi, what kind of words do you find all the time in Talmud Bavli? Persian words. Who knows Persian? Right? I don't. And by the way, ancient Persian. Well, guess what? In the 19th century, in Germany, with the rise of modern scholarship, these Jewish rabbis who went to university learned Persian in order to be able to do things. So, if you're interested at all in the etymology of a ton of words, get a Steinsaltz. And he always puts a little thing on the side, and sometimes he gives you the Greek, right? But sometimes he gives you from the Persian. And believe me, there's 1.5 million words that come from the Persian in there. Why the Persian? The Jews didn't live in Persia, they lived in a province of Persia. You see? And that's the culture they were subject to. And that's how people talked. So just like in Eastern Europe, they talk Yiddish. But if you go to Poland, there's a ton of Polish words. If you go to Ukraine, there's a ton of Ukrainian words in there. It's very different than the German in Germany. You see? Same thing in the Talmud. They talking Jewish, but they're using a lot of non-Jewish words in there. So just get used to that. So that's a kind of assimilation. That's my point. Now, in the Persian Empire, the problem was that they didn't have a bunch of religions, they had one. Okay? At least one of the elite level. And this is Zoroastrianism. Zoroaster was a certain type of a Navi, certain type of a prophet, and they produced a whole very rich religious culture of their own. With a lot of parallels, by the way, to the Talmud. So they're always saying, did A copy from B, did B copy from A, and all that. I'm a student who's written a lot about that. But let's put it this way. The Jews were pressured and persecuted from time to time during the period of the Amoraim by the Persians to force them to convert to Zoroastrianism. Right? There were times when they played hardball and they killed rabbis and things like this. There were times when the Persians grabbed little children and put them in Zoroastrian orphanages, to raise them as goyim and so on and so forth. There are such things in there. What do we have left over from this today? In the morning in davening, the Olam Yehei Adam Yirei Shemaim Seisa V'Goli, and so on and so forth, and you end it with a Shema. Right? You know what I'm talking about? At the very beginning of the davening, you see a little Shema there. Anybody got an art school sitter here? Want to give me an art school sitter?
Right here.
Yeah, he's coming.
He's handing one.
It's fine, it's okay. I'm doing it for a reason. If you go to L'Olam Yehei Adam, should be still here. You can look it up yourself. Oh, they took it out? Well, there was a Persian king, Yazdegerd, and he forced the Jews to convert. And how do you like that? Oh, here it is. Shema Yisrael. I'm reading from the art school. During the middle of the 5th century, the Persian king Yazdegerd II forbade the Jews to keep Shabbos or recite the Shema. Right? His purpose was to eradicate belief in God as a creator, which is symbolized by the Shabbos, and his oneness. Because Shema Yisrael Hashem Elokeinu Hashem Echad. In Zoroastrianism, you have dual, right? That the God idea is presented as double. Because everything in life is two. There's good and bad, there's tall and short, there's skinny and fat, there's the good side of, I'm serious about this, there's the good side of God, the bad side of God. That shows you there are two gods. When the Jews say Hashem Elokeinu Hashem Echad, they took it as a personal insult. So therefore he prohibited it. And there's oneness. To ensure that the Shema would not be read in defiance of his decree, the Persian king stationed guards in the synagogue for the first quarter of the day, which is Zman Kriya Shema. To counteract his design, the Chacham instituted 2 recitations of the first verse of Shema. One here and one in the Shabbos Kedusha Musaf. Okay? So in other words, the reason that you say this over here is because it's before the Persian police show up. And so at least he got in Shema. You understand? I'm simply saying it reflects the times when it's Persian there. And being Judaism, even though the Persian king died, all the rest of it, once you put them in again, you can't get rid of it. It's like a government agency, So this is what happens. Now, my point is that the Jews here acculturate to a certain degree, but there were plenty of other Christian and pagan groups in the area, so they weren't the only ones who were not Zoroastrians. This variety was good for the Jews and always is, because it means that there just wasn't a single religion of Zoroastrianism. So, I'll give you a minor example. Syria right now, as we speak, is changing. And they're killing out or changing all the little minority groups. You follow the news. The Druze, the Christians, the Alawites, the Armenians, the this, that, and the other, the Assyrians, and so forth and so on. Go back 100 years. In the old Syria, the majority was Muslim, but you had a lot of minorities. So the Jews are not the only minority. You see what I'm saying? But what happens if the whole country becomes Muslim and you're the only minority? Then it becomes a lot worse. So the Jews who lived in Babylonia during these centuries when the Gemara was put together were living side by side with Zoroastrians, but also with idol worshippers of various types, Christians of various types, all kind of groups. So it's not only that they're persecuting the Jews. Now, this is the stuff of Masechtas Avodah Zarah in the Gemara, in the Babylonian Talmud. So in the Mishnah, you have all these references to Greek and Roman gods, but in the Gemara itself, meaning the Babylonian stuff, you have references to pagan practices that were going on in Bavel. You see what I'm saying? Now, not only, sometimes they bring from Rabbi Yochanan and Rish Lakish what's going on in Israel. So there would be the Greek and Roman stuff. But if you're talking about Abaye and Rava and those type of people, the stuff that they're facing is your various Persian types of Avodah Zarah, and that's what you got to watch out for according to them. So if you went to Mesopotamia in the era of late antiquity, which is the centuries we're talking about, you'd see all kind of masses of Jews, because there are a lot of them. They all look like they're Gentile neighbors in many respects, but they're still identifiable as Jews. Okay? For one thing, if you're talking about the old days, the Jews are the ones on the street that don't have tattoos. Okay? And they don't have, pagan symbols on their clothing, which all the Goyim did. You see what I'm saying? So that's one way. There's Mesopotamia, by the way. See that today you call it Iraq. Here's the Jews. Here's the Euphrates. Here's the Tigris. They're close, aren't they? Right? They're close, and eventually they come together down here. This is the modern country of Iraq, where just can't see the two rivers so well. But in Hebrew, you call them Aram Naharayim. Naharayim is the two rivers. Okay? So Mesopotamia is Greek for Naharayim. And over here, where I'm pointing right now, the majority was Jewish. But there was a big minority, and everybody dressed kind of the same. Okay? But you can usually tell the guy's Jewish, like I said before, they have no tattoo, or they don't have a good luck charm over here, unless he did, and the things like that. Okay? So once again, the trick was not to not have a single item of clothing that wasn't uniquely Jewish. That was not possible. But rather it was to make sure that the Jew was distinct in some way. How do we do this nowadays, for example? Yarmulke. A guy could be dressed as fancy and as up to the latest fashion as all you want. I'm serious, right? Could dress to the nines. But he's wearing a yarmulke. There's a giveaway. And by the way, the yarmulke could be small. But for the purpose of identifying as Jewish, it suffices. You see? So this is an example I'm talking about in which you do, the person I'm talking about is dressed very American and very stylish and very on the latest sort of things. In other words, your kids, and right? And $500 shirts and so forth and so on, like in the yeshivas. But you can tell by the yarmulke. You see? By the way, it was extremely important for Jewish survival that the Jews here were always very loyal to the Persian Empire because they're always fighting the Romans. The Jews don't want the Romans to win. They hated the Romans for bringing down the Beis Hamikdash, properly so, and later for being the Christians. So whenever there's a war, the Persians know maybe we mess over the Jews and play with them sometimes, but they're on our side. I mean, they're not a disloyal element. You see what I'm saying? That's like very important. So life was funny in those days. During late antiquity, which means the 200s, 300s, the 400s, that sort of thing, you would have noticed the cultural difference between a Roman Jew and a Persian Jew. And a lot of times in the Talmud, they talk about Rabbi A moving from Babel to Israel, or Rabbi B moving from Israel to Babel. It's all over the Talmud. And believe me, when you moved over there, you changed your clothing. That's why you stuck out like a sore thumb. So a rabbi from the Roman province of Palestine moved to Babylonia, within a short time, you dressed like them, and vice versa. So you could tell the difference between one and the other by which culture they were assimilating to in their external clothing, especially in terms of religious customs. Here it's interesting. For certain reasons, you would have seen in Roman synagogues pagan motifs, in Byzantine synagogues that would never have been seen in Babel. Here you have the funny situation. I know we've all seen it one time or another. Let's go to the next one. If you go to Israel or some places over in the Eastern Roman Empire, you'll see these are in synagogues. I thought we didn't have pictures of people. Right? And by the way, this already is like, this is bringing the fruits of Israel. This is Abraham about to do the Akedah. That's some kind of a god. Right? That's some kind of a god, or, like a pagan god. What the heck is that doing in an Orthodox synagogue? You see? Let's go to the next one. Here you have, isn't that cute, cool? The fish is swallowing Pharaoh's thing. All right, that's in the biblical. So you have a whole wide variety. I think it's called Beit Alpha, and there's some other places. Some of you have been there. When you go to Israel, they show you these sorts of things. What is that? I'll tell you what it is. At least I'll tell you my understanding, which is all I can ever do. And that is, the rabbis were wiped out by the Romans in the 360s. That's one of the stories. It was a guy risking it. No, it was after the Roman Empire switched to Christian. For one reason or another, in the late 300s and 360s, they just killed out all the yeshivas and everything. But they didn't kill out all the Jews. So for the next couple hundred years, in the late 300s and in the 400s and in the 500s and even the early 600s, there are Jews in Israel and they practice Judaism, but no rabbis around. Okay? Now how they did, I don't know exactly. They must have developed some kind of scholarly class, and they had poets. We know that, because a lot of your piyutim and stuff like that come from that period. But there's nobody to tell them that this is not okay. And they see this in churches and in other buildings. And they say this, and after all, let's face it, what's wrong with putting the Akedah Yitzchak on the wall? What's wrong with putting the Kriyas Yamsuf on the wall? Okay? What about the zodiac and the sun god, all the rest of it? Every once in a while, I like a little shrimp. What can I tell you? Somebody in the shul said, this is good artistically. That must be, I think that's what happened. Because it wasn't Reformed Judaism, it wasn't a pagan Judaism, it's Judaism assimilating to pagan forms under the circumstances I just described, and but not giving up their Jewish identity or their Jewish prayer services or anything like that. And there's a classic example what I'm talking about of assimilation in the ancient world. Now I'm sure if ever a Babylonian rabbi visited Israel in the 5th century, he said, oh my God, what is this? This is treif, all the rest of it. But you know what they say, some frumak, daven by yourself. And by the way, the davening by this time probably was at least half in Greek. Okay, so you come into a synagogue, and you don't see three-dimensional statues, right? You don't see actual statues. You see paintings on the wall in mosaic form. All right, all right. Now, you know the old line: if you come to Babel, they a rice barfin, right? So you see different levels of sensitivity or revulsion to assimilation based on where you live. That's my point. Now I repeat, again, everybody was committed to what you and all today would call Orthodox Judaism. But they saw it differently. You understand? Here, go to the next, here, look at that. You got the zodiac up there. I thought we don't worship Ove Kochavim Mazolos. These are the Kochavim and the Mazolos. And they're in the shoal on the dome. Now they're pretty, you understand? And obviously, by the way, the people, those worshippers didn't agree with that. I'm sure in their davening, at some point, after saying Krishma, they probably said like this, and Jupiter, when the moon is in the seventh house, however that goes, you know, and therefore, lottery number 45762, you know, okay? That's how people work. Is that mean that they have abandoned Judaism? No, but they assimilated more of the outside world. That's what that means. Especially, as I say before, when there were no rabbi types to say this is usher and so on and so forth. Now, to tell you the truth, we have some of this in modern times. Where, let's see here. This is near Tubman. You got flags here?
Yes.
Uh,
I got it right there.
okay, so you got the American flag, the Israeli flag. Where'd that come from?
1948. I read once. I had a whole sermon on it.
But no, I'll tell you. Wait a second. Where did it come from? All the old shuls had flags. He says, where'd the idea of having a flag in there? It's a symbol. Really, 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 there should be no symbols other than the symbols of God. Yeah, but you know.
It's a flag.
Right? Now I want to tell you something. The FBI is not coming and raiding this thing. Okay? Even in 1948. But like that, people feel, you know, you see what I'm saying? It's not like they ask her, Moshe Feinstein or something, is it okay or not? You do it. Right? You do it. It became a norm. It became a norm. So that's an example of assimilation to American culture. Now, you're not breaking the law. You know, it's not against the Shulchan Aruch exactly, unless you want to construe it in such a way. But it's an example of American Orthodox Jewish assimilation. Right? That's what it is. So, you know, it depends on your point of view. You know, are you going too far and not going too far? It depends on your point of view. The zodiac thing, by the way, in the shul, raises the whole question of superstition. How is superstition defined? One person's superstition is another person's mystical reality. You see? Now, the ancient world abounded in superstitions. The Greeks had the Hellenistic superstitions big time. And the Persians, oh my goodness, right? As you might imagine. So what about the Jews? What about the Jews? Well, what's the Talmudic attitude? Okay? What is the rabbinic attitude? The answer is selective. Some superstitions were generally accepted, and some were the subject of disagreement among the Tanaim Amoraim. As they say, is this thing called Darchi Amori, or is it not called Darchi Amori? Is this let's put it this way, can you have a good luck charm, a talisman? See, a kamiyah, and Lochi Shalamaka, can you spit on a makkah and say certain things? All the rest of it. It's not what they teach in medical school, at least I hope not, but what's in there? Now, there have always been, you'll be shocked to hear, two contending, opposing attitudes on the questions of superstitions or mystical reality. One is the rationalists, like Maimonides, you know, who says it's all bogus, right? Now, how do you know? No, it's bogus, okay? But then, so in other words, the whole astrology is baloney. That's what he says. He makes a flat assertion. But then you have many others. Look at Ibn Ezra. There he is with an astrology ball. And what's his famous poem? Let's go to the next one. Ashkim lebeis asar, amrim kar rachav. Ol leizerev, amrim kar shachav. Yalam rakav, yalam go. Oy ish ani nolad bali kochov. What does that mean? When I come to a patron's house in the morning, they say he's already ready. No, I'm a shlamazel. Get him a shlamazel. He said, I come to hit up somebody for money. The guy left already. I come in the evening. He already went to sleep. Woe to the person born in misfortune. That's not what it says. You see, the translator is trying to, okay? You have to watch out for that. But you know what that means, right? I'm born under the wrong star. As we say today, got bad mazel. Right? We use the word mazel. Mazel means a star. You say mazel tov, or shlim mazel, or things like this, right? How come you lost this and did this? Have bad mazel. You understand? I mean, if you want to get my monadina out there, they'll throw you out. What do you mean mazel? What do you mean by that? Okay? So I'm trying to show you, okay? Now, again, the Rambam, of course, is going to say that all astrology it has a famous letter, you see at great length, in which he says, I studied the subject at great length as a youth, and I came to the conclusion it's all blood. Yeah, you did, because you were raised in this Islamic Almohad education system in which they were against anything involving astrology, okay? He had a letter from France, from southern France, Provence, to the Rambam. They asked all these questions, and he say, how do you explain astrology? Because I thought if you're good, you go to heaven, you're bad, you don't go to heaven. Some people are born, lucky, some people are born unlucky, according to, how do we square that? And he has a whole long thing, if you take a look at it. Ein roi, du rabosai, you should know, my friends, ein roi lo adam lahamin el be'echem shlosh dvarim. A person should always believe something for one of three reasons. Harishan davar shetil avraya bura midaita shel adam kugon chachma sacheshin gematria tkubas. Some things that are logical, like mathematics, right? Cheshvan, as he says, cheshvan gematrias and tkufas, or astronomy. Number two, yasigerim be'echem mechamash argoshes, something that can be perceived by the senses, by your five senses, taste, smell, touch, and all that sort of thing. You can taste something, and so on and so forth. Or something you have by reliable tradition from a Navi or a Tzaddik, because he's a from guy. And you have to classify in your mind the things you believe in. What do I believe because of category A? And what do I believe because of sense perception? And what do I believe because of reliable tradition? Who does that? The Rambam does that. Who talks like that? You know where they do that? In the spy business, in the intelligence business. If you're in the collation of intelligence data, like the CIA or whatever, they'll say, how would you rate this report? You understand? A, B, C, D, E, F, G, and what they want is A. Get it? So, I heard from a maid who had a friend who knew for a fact when the war would end. That's a C. Yep. That's a C. It's possible. It's a C. But somebody who was there and saw everything and has a reputation of being reliable, yeah, you might call an A. Or maybe they bring you a photograph or something like that. You understand? I guarantee you right now, as we speak, Israel and America are trying to evaluate what they did in Iran. Did they get rid of that, the centrifuges, other kind of business, and they're probably getting a ton of all kind of conflicting information and trying to sort it out. Now nowadays you got these big computers that help you, but the Rambam says you should be your own computer and figure out what it is. But if you believe in something not on the basis of pure logic or sense perception or a Masorah from a reliable person, from a Navi, then you're an idiot. All of them are Pesi Am L'chol Davar. Fools believe anything. Okay? And he goes on to say that that astrology is the wisdom of fools, meaning it's not true. And they wrote thousands of books, all this stuff. It's all been one big waste of time, and so on and so forth. And if you go 1, 2, 3, the fourth paragraph, now, right now, you and I are in the 3 weeks when we lost the Beis HaMikdash. Why did we lose the Beis HaMikdash? You can give a moral reason, Lashon Hara and all that stuff, or you can give a historical reason the Jews fought with each other or were unprepared. I don't know, the Rambam says The Jews were too much into hocus pocus. And they believe in astrology and the stars and all this other kind of business. And therefore, instead of concentrating on building up your West Point, they put their time and effort. Look what he says. This caused us to lose our kingdom. And the Beis Hamikdash should be destroyed. And lengthen our galus. Begana alone has brought us to this point we are today, in the bottom of suffering. Right? Because our ancestors sinned and are no longer here, namely, they read all these books in the Greek and Roman times. They were full of oracles and prophecies. If you ever read a Greek or Roman book, they're always going crazy over fortune tellers, oracles, prophets, signs. You understand? Oh, before the battle, he saw a white eagle or something like that. You see what I'm saying? That kind of business. The Roman army, if you know the old Roman religion, before a battle, they called out the Roman priests, and they killed a chicken, and they held the entrails up to the sun. And if the entrails had this kind of color, it's a bad sign, don't go to battle. If this kind of, it's a good sign, go to battle. The Roman army was the most scientific army of the rest of it. Everybody has a certain amount of smarts, everybody has a certain amount of dumb. That's it. I must have said this. There's a famous story of Chaim Weizmann met at a garden party. The Marquis of Reading was one of the leading English aristocrats who was Jewish. Rufus Isaacs. You can look him up. He was a poor boy in London who got a good education, had a brilliant career, and he was the Chief Justice of the British Supreme Court. He was the Viceroy of India. He was a Foreign Secretary. Not bad, okay? And he met Chaim Weizmann once in the 1920s, I think, and he said, you're doing this and this wrong, and this is what the Zionists should do, this, that, and the other. And when it's so long, finally Weizmann said something along the lines, hey, Retvi Anar, you talk like a fool. Me? A fool? Oxford, Supreme Court, Viceroy of India, this and so on and so forth. And Weizmann, the story goes, said, look, every person in the world is a combination of smart and dumb, to some degree. Some people are 50-50, some people are 60-40, some people are 40-60, yes? Some people are 90-10, or 10-90. There's no question that you, Lord Redding, with your career, you're definitely a 90-10. 90 smart and 10 dumb. No question about it. The problem is the 90 smart that you bestow on England, and the 10 dumb you reserve for the Jewish causes. You see? There's a lot of truth in that. You understand? So the Rambam was saying also, he said they were smart people, but they believed all these books. Our ancestors believed in this stuff and followed them. But before us, and they believed that these were genuine sciences. And they didn't do what they should have done, was to develop West Point, build up your military knowledge. You see, and that's why he says the Nevi'im called them fools, and so on and so forth. I, my money, studied this astrology at great length. My first subject that I mastered as a teenager in school was astrology. Leos, fortune telling by the stars, and I read all the Zura. There's not a single treif book that I didn't read. Okay, so obviously, as a teenager, he was fascinated by the idea of fortune telling and mastering the stars and planets and all that kind of business. But then I grew up. That's what he said. But then I grew up. And they actually have a book in Arabic showing how it's all baloney and so on and so forth. And he goes on to make his case, and I don't have to go much more other than to say that he said the Greeks and the Romans and the Persians and all this other stuff. And even though you'll find in the Gemara here and there. If you go to the very last, if you go to, well, you have to go back a little. Yeah, on that page, yeah. The last page, that's right. He says that even if you go into the Gemara, in the third line, I think, yeah, in the third line, I couldn't find a translation online. Told us you'll find in the Gemara here and there, someplace in the Medrash, that this rabbi, that rabbi says it was based on the stars and the astrology and all the rest of it. Don't be worried by that. You don't abandon common sense to go for strange things. And you can't go by what we would call today das yochitz, individual opinions you find in the Talmud, because maybe you don't know what they mean. So anyway, you have a strong school of thought against something like astrology. But you also have, within Judaism, especially under the Persian and Greek influences, a heavy, let's put it this way, a heavy introduction, belief in this. And I can tell you, most of our ancestors were into at a popular level into astrology at one point, something like this or that. And we even have certain dinim, by the way, something Shabbat on Tuesday, some Shabbat on Friday, based on that sort of business. Now, how does the Rambam know? He doesn't know. You can't know this. How do you know it's not true? But as a rationalist philosopher, he knows, dogmatically. Now, by the way, let's go to the next one. There's a great book by Professor Sarah Strumza, in which she looked up all the courses the Rambam took in high school and college. Because the Rambam is different than the other Rishonim, that he was a Marano, correct? He had to live a double life. Because of the circumstances that were taken out of Almahad. So by daytime he had to he had to follow all the Arab and Islamic stuff. And when nobody was looking, that's when he did the Jewish stuff. That's when he started up. So he had a very thorough education in Limudi Chol of all kinds. The Limudi Chol, which is not nonsense, and the Limudi Chol, which is nonsense. He had the whole 9 yards. And he grew up under the Almohads. And she, studies all that stuff, and you see a lot of traces of their teachings in his writings. You understand? He just put it into Jewish terms. No, he assimilated a lot of stuff that he learned, but flipped it into Judaism. Okay? Now, I've jumped ahead of myself in terms of chronology, but it's a great example of Jews and the question of assimilation of non-Jewish ideas, or their rejection. After all, what would the advocates of astrology say to the Rambam? You kafir, you've assimilated too much of the Goyish philosophy into your thinking, instead of thinking in genuinely Jewish terms. So you can flip it. What did the believers who believe in the stars and all the rest of it, what did they say to the Rambam with all this business he just called a bunch of baloney? You're wrong. You're a disbeliever. You grew up as a guy, which is true. By the circumstances of your life, you had to grow, to Islamic colleges and then learn all this stuff and all that. It messed you up. That's what they would say. You see? So in other words, each side is accusing the other side of having assimilated the wrong stuff. You see? Or maybe they call him a nebuch. That's a more firm way of putting it. But that's what the Kabbalists say. Right? Read the Shomer Munim. The Rambam doesn't have anything about Kabbalah. Nebuch, he wasn't exposed to it. He had a hard life. He lived in a different part of the world. He didn't know. It's sad. It's sad. You see how everybody flips it? The basic problem in all this was that ancient Judaism, certainly Rabbinic Judaism, doesn't have any theology. This is the right way. That's how the Jewish religion developed. In classic old Judaism, there's no insistence on exactness of doctrine and getting the belief correct. And this is what God is, and that's what heaven is, all the rest of it. But look in the Talmud. This one says this, that one says this, a third one says a third thing, and nobody's declared right because nobody knows. It's very honest. How do you know? You're guessing at the end of the day. You understand? Now again, it's not open season. There is a God. And there is a God who created the world. But I got news for you. There were different opinions. Did God create the world from pre-existing matter or from Yesh Miyayin and all this sort of thing? You find all over Chazal. This is how it goes. So, that's different than the Christian religion, which developed in very different lines. But in the diaspora, the ancient Judaism, which usually didn't have any theology, was forced to confront challenges from Christianity, Zoroastrianism, and later Islam, especially from Christianity, which is all about theology. So in Judaism, we're OCD on practice, but not on hashkafa. You get it? But in Christianity, it's the other way around. They're OCD on hashkafa, but not on practice. So in the Christian religion, from day one, they fought and had wars. Was Jesus holy? Was he not holy? Was he human? Was he half human? Was he partly immortal? What exactly was the relationship to Mary? What is the definition of Mary? What about if tease that a haircut is the hair holy and this, and that, and the other, which Jews say is ridiculous. But you ask a Christian, the Jews are arguing, if an egg was born on Yom Tov, can you use it the next day? Are you crazy? Each one says to the other, are you crazy? Because they're coming from different backgrounds. But when the Jews were in the Gauls, already starting in the Zoroastrian times, and in the Greek Empire, like I showed you last time, they had to deal with these challenges and try to explain the Jewish point of view with counter-arguments, okay? Now the problem is, of course, the Jews never developed the Vatican. We never had a state, and we never had a church. And therefore, there was no such thing as handing down from the Sanhedrin, this is the belief. Judaism simply didn't develop that way, okay? So there was no such thing as a church doctrine. But living in Gaulis was Judaism, the thinking Judaism intellectuals, was it able to ignore theological questions? And could it offer definitive answers on such a vast subject? At the end of the day, how do you know? The famous Sefer Kuzari is always about how do you know? Right? That's this question about the philosophers. You say, God can't be this, it must be that. How do you know? It's not logical. How do you know God is subject to logic? He created logic. How do you know? You see? Okay, let's leave the world of the eggheads aside and return to the life of the masses. In the 7th century, meaning in the 600s, the Middle East and the Jews experienced another wave of Hellenism in the form of Islam. What I mean by that is, usually a conquest means country A conquers country B and imposes a penalty on it, or takes away some of their land, or does this and the other, and then life moves on. But Germany remains German, and France remains French. Right? World War II. We beat the Germans, so he caused the Germans to give this up and do this and that and the other. It's still Germany, and France is still France. And Switzerland is still Switzerland. But sometimes, rarely, you have in history where country A takes over country B and completely changes it, transforms it. And that's what happened with the Greek conquest in the time of Alexander the Great, and it happened with the Arab conquest after Muhammad. They didn't simply conquer these countries, but they transformed them, okay, like a tidal wave. This we know. And so the Middle East and the Jews experienced another wave in the form of Islam. Once again, you had a vast, sweeping conquest that had different elements. First of all, there was a physical conquest. So the Arabs, as you know, created this giant empire. Look at this. From the Atlantic Ocean to India. It's pretty big. From the Atlantic Ocean to India. Now, that's humongous. They had a religious conquest because they Islamized all the people there. Do you need me to tell you that Egypt once upon a time was not Muslim? Egypt once upon a time was Egyptian with the pharaohs and the hieroglyphics and all that business, and later Christian.
90% Coptic Christian. About
And not only that's as late as that, but I'm saying before that, in time of Moses, meaning they had plenty of religious stuff before the Arabs showed up. Okay, and they're not Arabs; they're Egyptians. And same thing in different ways in Syria and what we call Iraq. Persia, I just told you, Persians had a vast culture and all this kind of stuff, religion and all the rest of it, and then they were conquered by the Muslims and Islamized. So they created this Islamic reality, which is the world in which we live today. But they also did a cultural conquest, which means they Arabized everybody. Not overnight, but it happened. So that's what we call today the Arab world, which what you really mean is the world of peoples who speak Arabic. You understand? I mean, really, really, really. Do the Moroccans and the Saudi Arabians have anything in common? They live over here and they live over there. And in Saudi Arabia, they are Arabs. But the Moroccans are not Arabs. They were conquered by the Arabs. And they were culturally imperialized and raped by the Arabs. And their old culture, whatever they had in the old Moroccan, was thrown out the window and replaced by the Arab stuff. And it took ad kedei kach, that today they consider themselves Arabs. And, the whole North Africa, for example, Tunisia and Algeria and so on and so forth. And Bavel wasn't Arab, it was Babylonian. It was Babylonian. With ancient cultures, Hammurabi goes back over there and stuff like that. And my goodness, they had their own religion and their culture and their writings and the, Ugaritic and this and that and the other, all this business. And doesn't matter. Now they're Arabs. You see what I'm saying? So this was a sweeping business. Now, the Jews who live now were, number one, conquered. Obviously. They didn't put up a fight. I mean, they're a tiny group. So they're conquered. They were not Islamized because of the accident that Muhammad in the Quran is supposed to have said that like this. There's only one true religion, and anybody who doesn't go along gets killed unless they convert. But that's because all the other religions don't serve God. Okay, I'll give you an example. The Hindus, the Buddhists, the Chinese thing, whatever, pagans. So they're all chayiv misa unless they convert. The Jews and the Christians, who Muhammad knew, they do serve God. Wrong, in the wrong way. They're screwed up. They're messed up monotheists for various reasons I don't have to go into. So therefore, they don't have to be killed, but they do have to be rendered inferior to realize that the real correct way is the Islamic way. So therefore, all the laws, whatever it's called, the Pact of Omar, so you can't be uppity, you have to be inferior in dress and in buildings and all kind of things like that. And that was the system over there. So the Jews were not Islamized. They did remain Jewish by religion. Okay, that's very, very important. By the way, I know you follow the news. In Syria, you have all this internecine fighting. The new government in Syria are from Muslims. It's like a certain ISIS, certain type. And they just issued a new constitution. Because Syria, before this, under Assad and all that, was officially a secular country. And they had a secular constitution, going back to the 1940s, I think. And they changed it every once in a while. But now that they're taken up by a religious group, so this guy now, Jelani, that Trump met with, so they issued a new constitution in which it said Syria recognizes all the divine religions. Do you know how to decode that? What it means is like this. Obviously Islam. Christianity is a divine religion, like I just told you. If there were any Jews in Syria, which there aren't, that would be a divine religion because of what I just told you. But if you're Alawite, or Shiite, or Druze, or Yazidis, you're chayiv misa. And the Constitution says that, because we only recognize divine religions, those correct religions. You see? So the world isn't paying attention to that, but they will, as time goes on. So the Jews, anyway, were not Islamized, but you had to follow the inferiority rules. But if you did that, you could practice Judaism. In the first 100 years, a lot of the conquered non-Jews were not Islamized or Arabized, but over the course of time they were. Although there definitely was a Christian minority, as you just said, a lot of people in Egypt were Coptic Christians, for example. The Jews were Arabized, though, and there's the assimilation. Because the Jews stopped speaking Aramaic and Greek, whatever they did, and switched to Arabic. Okay? In the beginning, the Jews in the Middle East spoke Aramaic like their neighbors. That had been the case, but over time, the Jews will speak Arabic, they'll dress Arabic, they'll adopt Arab ways. You got a lot of assimilation over here. That's why they practice polygamy. Okay? Now, Judaism has polygamy in the old, in the Bible and all the rest of it, but there was very, very, very little of it. There's a lot more in the Arab world, meaning when the Jews live in the Islamic Empire, there's a lot more of that. And it's not because, we can, because the Torah says that Abraham had more than one wife. It's because your neighbors have it. You understand? And therefore, the Jews are picking it up. So there's a lot of ways in which they assimilated too. Now, at the same time, the Jews will be very distinct by their religion. And this is the Middle Ages, called the Age of Faith, in which you're defined by which religious group you adhere to. In Syria now, you saw they went around killing groups over here, men, women, children here and there. They look the same as the others. They ask them, what are you? And what they mean is, what religious group do you belong to? Are you Alawite? Are you Druze? Are you this? Are you that? The guy said, well, I speak Arabic and I dress Arabic. Yeah, but what are you? So in the Middle Ages also, the Jews can dress Arabic and they can talk Arabic, but what are you? You see? And that was a marker. Part of Islam is condescending, and worse than that, to non-Muslim subjects. So the Jews were definitely compelled for 1,000 years, to step and fetch it. My point throughout the exile is that anti-Semitism, and that's what I'm talking about, in its various forms and degrees, but always with civic inequality, counters the kind of assimilation that we see, let's say, for example, in America today. Okay? So, in all these contexts that I'm talking about, not in America today, in the old days, Middle Age, like in the Arab world, the empire, what was the position of Jews? Is a balance. On the one hand, there's a certain amount of assimilation. On the other hand, the anti-Semitism prevents real assimilation. You get it? If a Jew stepped too far and didn't convert, they kill him. So at the end of the day, you're a Jew, a dirty Jew. And that kind of helped prevent the kind of assimilation that leads to a buckle in the majority. Unlike in America today, well, let's say today, until 2025, right? In which you had such an opening and a welcoming society, that the Jews assimilate to the point of losing their identity. That's what that's all about. So here we're taking back in history, and we see the assimilation and balancing with the anti-Semitism. This anti-Semitism caused the Jews in the empire to circle the wagons to the degree possible and try to hang out with other fellow Jews, otherwise where do you get your protection? One way is to be bilingual in a funny way, and that's a classic Jewish attempt to deal with the challenge of assimilation. Throughout history, Jews in Gullus will speak two languages when possible. The formal language and yeshivish, if I can use that term, the Jewish dialect. So in the Middle Ages, in the Middle East, the Jews will know Arabic, but they'll speak Arabic Yiddish, Judeo-Arabic as they call it, okay? And that's the sprach between us. See, I just used a word. So Maimonides writes all of his books, his books to the Jews in Judeo-Arabic. Funny, the great works of medieval Jewish philosophy written in Yiddish, meaning in Arab Yiddish. Not in Arabic, in Arab Yiddish. So the Rambam's Mernevuchim, the Kuzari, Sadi Gonzim and Zudeos, the Chovos HaLevavos, these are classics. Now, what you see in front of you are Hebrew translations of them. What's the point of showing you the Arabic? If you saw the original Arabic, they're in Hebrew letters. It says, mamish like Yiddish. You're writing a funny kind of German, but using Hebrew letters. And that's what makes it Jewish. What does it make it Jewish? So the other guy down the street who's not Jewish can't read it. You see? It's the same thing in the time of the Rambam. He writes all of his stuff, and the Chovos of the others, it's in Hebrew letters. It's in Arabic, but you see a lot of Jewish words, and you see a lot of Jewish isms, right? Bible isms, Talmud isms. It's kind of cool if you're the type of academic that knows Judeo-Arabic. You can have fun with this sort of thing. Now, let me say this about the Rambam. When he wrote his medical books, they're in Arabic, not in Jewish letters. Why? Who's the audience? Right? If you're writing a book on, diseases of the skin or hemorrhoids or this sort of thing, all these things that Rambam wrote about, gynecology is in Arabic with Arabic letters. But when he writes his Igeris Taimon, his letter to the Jews in Yemen, in which he says, don't give in to these crazy Muslims, Muhammad with the Meshuggah, that's what he says over there, that's in Yiddish. Right? Because he could get killed for that. Right? Or worse. In fact, even so, he was taking his life in his hands because maybe somebody would be on Malshin and telling him. Right? But at least don't be stupid enough to actually write it in Arabic. Because no Arab can read Hebrew letters. You see? So here you have assimilation and the responses to it. This leads to the wider discussion of assimilation of Arab culture in the Middle East. Assimilation, Jewish assimilation of Arab culture in the Middle East. I said of, I didn't say assimilation into Arab culture. How much of the Arab culture did the Jews pick up? You see, that's the point. Not that you dissolve into the host culture. Medieval Arab culture was very brilliant. Ada Yom Hazeh, the Arabs are always dreaming, going back to the Golden Age. What is behind all the ISIS and all these other nuts? They want to go back to the old caliphate when we ruled the world and we produced science and art and literature, and they did, okay? And Cordoba and Baghdad, there's truth to that in the Middle Ages, okay? In the Middle Ages. The civilization that the Arabs produced in their Middle Ages, in their Golden Age, this is the Golden Age of the Arabs, had two faces, religious and secular, their culture. The religious part was on the Quran, on Islam and stuff like that, and they did amazing things, no question about it. But that had no attraction for the Jews. Why am I interested in some pirush on the Quran? But the secular stuff is a different story. After all, maybe I'm interested in mathematics, science. I heard the Arabs invented something called algebra. Right? I heard the Arabs did something called numbers. You see how much we get from the Arabs? The Arab culture? Right? And now, by the way, what's treif about arithmetic? Nothing. What's treif about geometry? Nothing. So I could be a Jewish boy or girl. I could be living in Baghdad, for example, in the year 900. And I'm a good Jew. I'm a good Jewish boy. I'm a good Jewish girl. I happen to be interested in math. Shoot me. Right? I like astronomy. And I can read Arabic because I live in Baghdad. I'm Jewish, but I can read Arabic. Now at home we talk Yiddish. But in the street, I can talk to other people who are not Jewish. I know Arabic, I can read it right. And I see there's a book on geometry, or on astronomy, or geography, or anything like that. It's not treif, right? It's just what we call today neutral, it's science. So the Jews could assimilate the secular culture of the Arab world if they wished to. Because the linguistic ability they had, and there's nothing offensive in any of these subjects, medicine being an outstanding example. Medicine fascinates me, as somebody might say. And I want to read all these books, because once upon a time, the way you became a doctor is you read books. God help your first 100 patients, until you figure out what to do. But, well, when a guy coming into the operating room and said, I always wanted to do one of these. But wait a second. You picked up one of these books and you could read it, and now you know as much chemistry as the Arabs, as the non-Jews. So you've assimilated this part of your, as I said before, it's not like Ashkenaz. We'll see next time, I hope. In Ashkenaz, the Jews did not learn Latin, and they couldn't read the French and the German languages. They couldn't read it. And therefore they weren't interested in it. They developed a very isolationist kind of culture. In the Arab world, it didn't have to be like that. Same way in the USA today. I don't care how frum somebody is. Somebody might want to become a frum doctor. There's nothing treif, so to speak, about becoming an anesthesiologist or something like that. Right? And, I was just in Teaneck. Half the place are doctors who give daf yomis. Right? So you can, because this part is not antithetical to that part. That's my point. So the only area would be metaphysics, which today is not a science. It was that time. That's what's the invisible world like? You understand? That's a little bit different, because then you mess with religion. How did these Arabs, who were like sand jockeys, discover secular culture? They didn't have a culture before the 600s and 700s. The answer is the Arab Empire bordered on ancient headquarters of culture. Go back. Here. This is the end of the Arab Empire. It's up to India. India has all the math and science of the ancient world. It's one of the two places. 3. China, India, and the Greeks. You see? So the Arabs, when they took over this area, they found all the Greek libraries. When they took over this area, they found all the Indian libraries. They've been translated into Persian. And so they discovered all this knowledge that they never even thought about before. And they learned how to read and write. It could happen. Okay? So for the Greco-Romans in the West, who were the main people that translate Goyish books into Arabic in the Middle Ages? In other words, the Greek philosophers and doctors, the Indian geometry people and mathematicians and all that business. It's Jews and Christians. It's Jews and Christians, right? Christians and Jews, Jews and Christians. See, because in Arab, I'm not bothering to learn another language. Why should I do that? All the other languages are inferior. A Jew and a Christian, almost by definition, is better off they know more than one language. You see? And therefore, you can make money out of it. So, what do you call a frum Jew in the 800s who spends his career translating Greek philosophy books into Arabic for the Goyim? He's a frum Jew. Is he assimilated? He's acculturated. He has assimilated into himself a lot of outside knowledge, but he's a Shomer Shabbos, as we say today. It's tricky. You see, it's tricky. Now, I spoke a couple years ago about Chaz David Shaprut, who was the prime minister unofficially in Spain, remember in the time of Abdurrahman III. How did he become famous? Chazdai. He translated the, Materia Medica of Dioscorides, the original pharmacy book, which supposed, Dioscorides is supposed to have had all the original, herbs and things like this. That was this is the main book of pharmacology, okay? Old pharmacology. The Arabs heard about it. They couldn't read it. And this guy, Chazdai, lived in Spain. He came from a rich family. And he learned, because of his parents gave him a good education, Latin and Greek, among other things, and Arabic, of course. And he got a hold of a copy from the Byzantines. And he and a priest translated into Arabic. Oh my goodness, he became a celebrity overnight. And properly so. So as a Jew transmitting non-Jewish stuff to other non-Jews, he's certainly assimilated in the sense that he's not Mea Sha'arim, okay? But on the other hand, what is that? You see? That's the tricky part of the assimilation over there in the 10th century. Now, is Chazdai an assimilated Jew? Yeah, he was like Henry Kissinger. I told you about a couple of summers ago. He was the troubleshooter for the Caliph of Cordoba. He was the finance minister. And in some respects, he ran the country behind the scenes. Not in front, but behind the scenes. So he was a very, very important person. And believe me, he had to know everything about Islam and Arab stuff, because at that court, if you're Jewish, you dance on eggs. You see? But he pulled it off. Now, wait a second. He has assimilated Arab culture big time. But at the same time, is he a Jewish Jew? You bet. He's the one who starts patronizing the Hebrew poets, the Hebrew philosophers, the Hebrew grammarians. In other words, he sees the Arab stuff, and in the front he has to smile over here and like that. When he goes home, he said, why don't we have this stuff? Because the heck with the Arabs. The Jews are number one. Hebrew is the Lashon Kodesh, not Arabic. You see? Our tradition is the true one and not theirs. And therefore, where are our guys? He said, well, nothing happens without money. I will bankroll, this scholar and that thing and so on and so forth. Okay? In other words, what I'm trying to say is, he has a creative response to the assimilation to Arab culture. Meaning, he develops Arab culture in a Jewish key. The entire golden age of the Jewish culture in Spain is a knockoff. The Jews are imitating what the Arabs are doing. Either I'm doing something right or I'm doing something wrong. Right. Maybe I should start this speech all over again.
Until it stops.
Right. Yeah. You? Math and science? Now, wait a second. The golden age of medieval Jewish culture, where does it take place? In Muslim Spain. It's not encouraged by the Muslims. They couldn't care less. To them, the whole Judaism and the culture is dreck. But it's tolerated by them. And it's the Spanish rich Jews who patronize and consume the brilliant Jewish culture of imitation. So, the Arabs are into dikduk, the Jews will invent dikduk. The Arabs are into poetry, big time, the Jews will create medieval Jewish poetry. The Arabs are into religious philosophy. The Jews are whatever the Arabs do, the Jews are doing. Right? I mean, they didn't come up with computer science. They came up with what was going on at that time, but Jewish in Hebrew for Jews, and even if they write in Arabic, it's Yiddish, as I told you before. You see, it's Yiddish. So this is what you call a constructive response to assimilation, appropriating certain elements, but then Judaizing them and making them the unique property of the Jewish people. So what did they produce so famously in the golden age of the Jews in Spain? Diktuk, Tanakh, Shira, poetry, science, because a lot of books come out in math and science and math and astronomy and all that kind of stuff in Hebrew for Jews, right? So again, it's at theology where it gets tricky. The question of assimilation gets interesting because the cutting edge of Islamic thinking in the High Middle Ages was philosophical metaphysics, trying to understand what goes on in the other world, the other dimension of reality, where you die, what happens there. In Islam, they definitely worked their way to no Trinitarianism. There's one God, indivisible. Incorporeality, the philosophers work it out that God doesn't have any goof or anything like that, even though the Quran is full of that. They do believe in creation and time, that the world's created. That wasn't always there. They do discuss very heavily in Islamic philosophy divine attributes, because again, in the Quran, God is merciful and He's this and that and the other. But how can God have any attributes? Because if He created everything, then He created the attributes. So He can't have them. You see? But then, what am I supposed to say about God? They do debate in Islam, question of literal versus allegorical. What do you take literally and what you don't? Faith versus reason, rationalism versus mysticism, religion versus spirituality. Religion versus spirituality. Where did the Jews copy that one? Chobas HaVavos. Written by a Jew in Muslim Spain in the 1000s. And he's really copying from Sadiq, but Sadiq is copying from the Muslims, right? Where they talk about there's religion and there's spirituality. There's rote performance of the duties, and then there's doing with the inner stuff in there, right? Which is for an elite. The Rambam's son, Avraham ben Rambam, Abraham Maimonides, if you know who he was, he wanted to introduce Sufi practices into the synagogue, into prayer service. In other words, going like this and meditating and the kind of things that certain Hasidim have picked up on their own later. He wanted to do back in the 1200s. The shul went crazy and voted down because they were very Litvish and this Haigdami, do all this kind of. Well, where did he get it from? He's looking for spirituality. He actually has a book on this. Let's go to the next one. Go. Yeah, that's his book. Hamaspik Lovdei Hashem. This is a new translation. The original translation in English from the Arabic was Rabbi Rosenblatt back in the 1930s in Bet Tefillah. But nobody can read the English. It's too heavy. So, and he's really, let me put it this way. This is Avraham ben Rambam, a great Jewish rabbi, and by the way, a very big MD. He was the director of the big hospital in Cairo in the 1200s. Him and another guy. That was a hospital with thousands of beds. And so he was at the top of the medical practice. He's a very learned person, but he's trying to find how to be from getting past all the externals. That's what this book is about, not all of which survives. And very heavily influenced, as you can see, by the Islamic ideas of how do you serve God lishma. Okay? So, of course, there's a lot of picking up from one to the other. Would you call Avraham ben Rambam assimilated? All these are explored and debated among the Muslim scholars. They're also going to be debated by the Jewish scholars in the Islamic world, but they'll do it in the Jewish key. So if you read this book, which again is translated from the Arabic, if you read this book, it's very Jewish, right? But at the same time, it's very much a product of a Jew living in the Islamic Middle Ages. To sum up, we're talking about the Jews that we call today the Edot HaMizrach. The Jews who grew up centuries and centuries in the Islamic world. They're physically shakua in the Islamic world. They're living there for 1,000 years, more. They're physically surrounded by the Arab stuff all around them. They're culturally shaku in that universe. All their ideas and values you see in the street are from the Islamic world. They blend in many ways, but they are distinct and very distinct at the same time. They're always the other because of their religion. At the end of the day, the different religion is what keeps them Jewish and not losing their identity. Nowadays, today, and for the last 50 years, 40 years, the PLO and those guys, Arafat, and now the Iranians, they're always saying like this: the Eidot HaMizrach in Israel are really Arabs. It's a certain tactic. You get it? That they're Arabs. The Zionists have kidnapped them and brought them to Israel, and they've tried to alienate them from their Arab brothers. So join us, the Palestinians, and get rid of the Ashkenazic overlordship and make one big Palestinian state, and you'll be Arabs and Jews like in the good old days. Now, that's what it is. The problem is the Eidot HaMizrach remember what it was like when they lived in the Arab countries, right? And although they were mistreated in Israel, that is true. But let me put it this way: if I were an Iraqi Jew and living in Israel today, I say like this: what have I gained by being out of Iraq since 1950s? A lot. Right? What have I gained by being out of Iran? What have I gained by being out of Egypt and these other countries? What have I gained by not being in Syria in the last 25 years? You understand? So therefore, the Jewish tradition is hit the road, Jack, right? Or hit the road, Yasser, because they know. But it's a question of the Arabs are trying to say, no, you're assimilated to us. You're only different in terms of religion. And Avadio said, I guess, that makes all the difference. That makes all the difference. Now, by the way, if they ever fell for this, and they would set up a Palestinian state, they would check them 2 days later, like you see is going on now.
Yes.
Like you see is going on now. But they're never even going to get to that level because they know enough to know that it's baloney. That's enough for tonight, so good night.
Thank you. Thank you.
We'll daven Marvin in 2 minutes.